Small news update on the Canonical Open Documentation Academy. We've had our first contributions to a non-canonical project, which is important to all of us, actually. The open printing organization, they've had a couple of issues on there for a while, and a couple of contributors have started taking on those tasks. I've said it before, and it's something we need to really look into again, is trying to get more external projects, because we really don't want this. We want it to be as broad and as wide as possible. I am really excited about today's session, which Vladimir is going to host, and I must say he's very bravely taken this on. Vladimir is going to be doing a fight or a comparison between Markdown, restructured text, AsciiDoc, and XML, which is an awful lot to try and condense even into the hour if it takes that long. So to give him as much bandwidth as possible, I'm going to hand it over to you, Vladimir. And thanks again for taking this on.
Thank you very much, and hello everyone. Let me start sharing my screen. This one. Yep. Oh, I hope everyone can see it.
Looks great.
Great. So we will talk today about these lightweight markup languages, Markdown, AsciiDoc, and restructured text, and also we will compare them in between and with XML. Let's start. First of all, I want to explain a little bit that XML is a bit of a standout, but we still consider all of them doing mostly like pursuing the same goals if we're talking about, of course, in the context of documentation. So the best way to describe their nature of coexistence was through this picture of presenting them as team members, but doing things a bit slightly different, with XML maybe being a little bit of a weird kid, so a little bit of a standout. I'll explain that a little bit later. So for now, let's stick to the idea that the first three is Markdown, restructured text, and AsciiDoc, actually lightweight markup languages, while XML is something a bit different. We'll get to it. So first of all, how and when they were created, or at least why they were created. So the first three being lightweight markup languages were created mostly for easy-to-read efforts to document stuff, and like beginning of this 21st century. And XML was created slightly earlier and as an effort to actually store and transmit any type of data, actually, at least structured one. So basically, later on, we started using them through some extensions and standards like DITA, DocBook, and S1000D to actually store documentation in. We'll talk in more detail later on, and please be advised that some of the comparisons between them would be arbitrary by my own experience and opinion. Of course, feel free to discuss that at the end of this talk. We will have some Q&A session, and I hope you will express some of your likes and dislikes about any of them. So first of all, the lightweight markup languages are used in an approach known as docs as code, which is basically states that we treat our documentation content similar as software developers treat their source code of their software. That means that we actually store the source code, and then we kind of can build it somewhere else. And this approach of as code actually can be used for many different things, like I don't know, infrastructure as a code, probably most notable one. And the approach is the same. We have some source code that we can later use for some actions, in this case for the documentation. And the approach actually benefits from all the features that version control systems, modern systems like Git, can provide us with. And that's true not only for lightweight markup languages originally used in docs as code, but also for XML-based solutions. Although when we talk about Git changes, obviously some lightweight markup languages are easier to understand and to see by human eye. That's why it's even easier to work with these pull requests in these lightweight markup languages. Nevertheless, VCS can be used, like any version control system can be used for any of those to track changes. That's the main issue here. So the process looks like that. We have some source code stored, preferably in some repository. That source code contains all the content that we have in our documentation, and it's not shown here, but also we have some resources like images, some code snippets, whatever else we need. So all the sources that we need, we store in the repository, and then we use some kind of a builder, which is like in the middle here. This builder actually usually has a design template in mind. So the end result or published documentation is a result of this assembly. So assembly defined not by only source codes, but also by the builder. The point here, the very important one, is that when we change the source content, our published documentation will also change, but most often our builder remains the same if we don't decide to improve it, of course. That's actually very important because we can store all the changes in the content and see them over time and build like some older versions at any point of time. That's why using these version control systems can be very beneficial for some products that actually need historic data on their documentation, but also to see some contributions made by community, for example. So there are many benefits in that. And talking about benefits, we have some pros and cons of Doc's code approach in general. I will not read all of them because there are many benefits. I will probably stick to the negatives here just to be a little bit faster. So when I say additional efforts, obviously we need some kind of experience and skills to use Git, basically version control system, to store our content. And most of the time we need some idea how to run the builder to actually produce our content, maybe even how to publish it later on. Although it can be automated by CI/CD, it still takes some additional effort to set everything up. So both additional efforts and the steeper learning curve is right here. I just told you why. But we also have some lack of WYSIWYG, or what you see is what you get approach here, just because the simplicity of syntax kind of suggests that you can just go there and fix content however you like just by looking at it directly. If you really need this rendering going on, some text editors have these preview functions. But I know there are some Markdown editors with WYSIWYG, but not too many solutions actually use it because it's not really needed for such a simple syntax. Also, sometimes they say better is not included when we are talking about some open source solutions. But what I really mean by fine-tuning here is that you have so many different tools, many of them open source, and to actually combine them together, make them work, it requires some a little bit setup efforts, obviously, and knowledge skills. That's true for many open source solutions, and that's also true. Let's move on. So basically, we have these three main lightweight markup languages. At least I'm familiar with mostly usage of these three when we're talking about Doc's code: Markdown, reStructuredText, and AsciiDoc. And we'll talk a little bit in detail about each one of them. So Markdown is the simplest one. You see it's a very simple syntax, not too much for special symbols we see on the screen. Yet it's kind of like easy to read, it's easy to understand, and it's a bit, it's short, and it's you can call it concise even. So there are some benefits to it, and what you can see is there's a simple example that I will be using in all of the markup languages we'll be discussing today. So just familiarize yourself with the main structure. We have some headings, we have some text with bold, italics, and other formatting, link, some code blocks, and picture at the end. And the second example actually includes some lists and a table. Yeah, tables actually a very notable element of Markdown because they are horrible, at least by a popularity vote. So yeah, you can memorize how they look like here. Let's move on. We discussed pros and cons of the Markdown in comparison to other lightweight markup languages. As I said, it's a real simple syntax. It's really easy to use even if you don't have much experience with. It's very, very popular, actually, used in many, many different solutions. So there are so many tools that use Markdown nowadays. And on top of all that, it actually also has pretty good extensions. So we can extend functionality of Markdown And on top of that, we can use directly HTML code if we miss something in this functionality. And speaking of which, we will miss some of its functionality because it's not very rich out of the box, and that is the first negative side here. Also, we have lack of standardization. Because of this lack of standard functionality, people tend to extend features by adding so-called flavors or using extensions to their own code, and those could be quite custom. So every solution using Markdown can use some custom extensions and even custom solutions to do some interesting stuff with it. That creates a mess, plain and simple. Very primitive tables. We don't have much in terms of merging cells or formatting them in any interesting way. And also, as far as I understand, there are no includes, so we cannot include the content of another file into the existing one. That's basically it. Let's move on. This is a list of like the most popular, I guess, flavors of Markdown. And there are many, many more of those. This is restructured text. So basically, this is the syntax used by Sphinx mostly and DocUtils. It's a bit different, especially when we're talking about these headings. It's more or less similar when we talk about formatting, although there are some differences here. You just have to remember them. It's most confusing when you have to use both Markdown and restructured text because they are kind of similar, but you keep forgetting which one is which. And yeah, ideally stick to one of them, and it will be easier that way. It still has these code blocks and pictures. I wouldn't call them ideal solution aesthetically wise. They look kind of wordy and verbose, but we have them, and they're pretty flexible actually in what they can do if you learn some Python. So the second example looks like that. Those are the list and the table. The table actually, as far as I understand, we can do a little bit more than we can in Markdown, but still not great. Some additional features are there, but it's not ideal, unfortunately. So here are the pros and cons. It's very, very flexible, especially if you know this Python, because it can be extended to very long extent. And also it is standardized. So unlike Markdown with all these flavors and extensions, restructured text is quite good, and the feature set from the beginning. It can be extended, of course, in a custom way, but the feature set is there, so the standardization is also there. And also these custom components are more or less standardized in their syntax too. And it's feature rich. As I said, out of the box, it has some additional features on top of what Markdown has. But it's a bit more verbose, slightly more in terms of lines of code and special symbols in there. It's a bit harder to read. It's much less common than Markdown. So it's not a problem because it's still kind of easy to learn, but still it has limited support in tooling and instruments. There are not so many tools that are supported. Actually, most popular tools like GitHub already supported, but still in comparison to Markdown, it's just much less popular, both through professionals and tools. Just you have to adjust to that. And also sometimes when you really need to do something interesting with it, you kind of need Python in there. I wouldn't consider it strictly a negative side if you know Python, but still. And let's move to AsciiDoc, which is actually my favorite. But I think you will be able to tell that on the pros and cons side. This is the example. It's I call it the most elegant out of three, but it's only my opinion. You can disagree with that. I especially like how source code blocks actually formatted. I really enjoy working with it. And this is how tables look like. That's obviously not all the features it has. I think AsciiDoc actually out of the box has the most in terms of features for the tables and their formatting and what you can do with them, but also quite good with working with lists and some additional features like tag includes and stuff like that. In terms of pros and cons, like I said, you can call me biased, okay? So the pros, it's very, very flexible. You can do so many different things with it. It's very good in terms of standardization because we literally have the AsciiDoc language. It can be extended by the syntax of macros in Antora, but still it's kind of standard. It's feature-rich out of the box. You have so many different features. I think out of the box, we have even more than reStructuredText can offer us. And also, it's very great with tables. So if you need like some merged cells or some formatting or table inside table, code blocks inside table of a table, anything, it can do it. It's really very, very powerful. I'm not sure the renderer will be able to render all of that, but still, it can literally provide you with ways to express yourself in the syntax. On the con side, we have I think it's even less common than reStructuredText, but it's like just my observation. I'm not sure it's accurate, and it still has limited support. Also, still some very popular instruments like GitHub already support AsciiDoc syntax. So in terms of tooling, yeah, it's still kind of limited, just like reStructuredText. This is where I try to assess the verbosity of the examples I just provided you with, basically by the number of lines. It's not very accurate. I understand that the examples themselves may be not very greatly designed just for that purpose, but still we have some reference numbers, with Markdown being one of the best, AsciiDoc being right after, and reStructuredText in some cases being a little bit lengthy, especially in these code blocks. So yeah, this is just as a consider it my opinion of feeling. It can be very specific to your use case. So in general comparison, yet again, it's more or less opinionated. So language popularity, Markdown, I think most people would agree that the most popular one and has the best tool variety overall. Yet the features provided by the Markdown out of the box probably on the lacking side. For the reStructuredText and AsciiDoc, they both, I would say, share the second place in lightweight markup languages. In tooling variety, I'd say that reStructuredText mostly rely on the Sphinx. It has also DocSutils, but it's not. I'm not sure. My feeling is that everyone uses Sphinx for reStructuredText. AsciiDoc has both Antora and AsciiDoctor, so it's, I guess, slightly better, but it's arguably. Features, yeah, both reStructuredText and AsciiDoc provide great set of features. I'm not sure we can consider AsciiDoc being like so much on top that I can express it here on this relatively rough table. So going to tooling examples, just some examples. It's not an exhaustive list, but in terms of reStructuredText, we have Sphinx and DocSutils. In terms of AsciiDoc, we have Antora and AsciiDoctor. But for Markdown, the list is so long, I wouldn't even dare to provide you like enough. There are so many, like literally hundreds and hundreds of different solutions that can generate your documentation out of Markdown. And on top of that, the Markdown actually supported by so many different systems for, I don't know, messages, comments, anything. It really used a lot by many, many systems. So tooling, Markdown obviously is the top here. Let's move on to the XML part, of which we have DITA, DocBook, and S1000D. Basically, XML originally been for storing data, not like human recognizable writing of the docs. So yes, even though these extensions trying to address some of the issues, they still cannot overpass the limitations that XML actually provides us. And XML is kind of an older format. You might be familiar with XML through like data transmission already. It's been used, I don't know, more than 10 years ago. It was very popular on the web, but then it was kind of the competitor of JSON was actually so successful that XML's usage got like on decline pretty fast. And the main reason was that XML was quite heavy, even for the machine data exchange. So the overhead was quite big, and human readability was not that great. JSON felt better in both aspects. So here, when we're talking about writing documentation, it feels even more because we're talking about humanly readable documentation, and it's producing. What you see here is an example of DITA. Basically, it's one of the formats that is XML-based, and it can be used by many different solutions. But here we are. It's kind of looks with a lot of text. It's really hard to read, yet it provides some additional benefits that we will talk a bit later on. This is basically the same example You see how big it is, especially when we talk about this table. That's because of the nested text. We have the indentation here, more or less correct. So while it's somewhat easier to read if you consider all the indentation and structure, it's still quite verbose. So yeah, I would say it's not as humanly readable. As for main benefits, it's very oriented on structured writing. When we have a topic-based pieces of content that we can reuse in multiple pieces, like multiple documents, multiple parts of the same document, whatever. So basically, this modular topic-based approach to the content is a cornerstone of it. But also, we have nice features like conditional publishing. So depending on the conditions, when we build our documentation, we can include or exclude some of the content. And also, it tends to be quite good for large-scale operations and sophisticated sets of documents. Just because of how good XML to store all the metadata and how topic-oriented approach is good to actually track all the different content you need in a document throughout your base, like document base. This is DocBooks and second format in XML-based section. Basically, also it's XML-based, so it's using all the text. I don't think it's more or less readable than the first one. I'd call it pretty much the same level. I'm not sure I can easily read this. And this is a second example, also quite lengthy, also quite a lot of nested levels for the tables. And the best part of DocBook is that it's actually quite good for basically books and articles and any structured content that actually has this, flow from the beginning, like from top to bottom. So basically, it's quite good for cross-media publishing. It's optimized for the books publishing and stuff like that. Also, it's quite customizable and it's flexible with what I can do, but not as modular as DITA with its topic-based approach. S1000D here, the example, the very same semantics as the previous examples. I barely can see the headings here, and I can try to understand where the picture is. It's really hard to read in my mind, and the table example, I think it's even bigger. I didn't even try to count the lines. It's notoriously bigger and harder to read. But S1000D is actually a very special one. It is quite widely used in a special context of compliance, like very, very, very close to safety and aerospace engineering and all these fields that actually require a lot of industrial standards. So basically, it follows a very rigid XML structure, and it has very good approach to following these compliance-based big sets of documentation. And yeah, if you working within some kind of regulated area field, then yes, it's probably a standard for you. It also uses something like a data models, but I never used S1000D myself, so I cannot comment how close that is to the topic-based structured approach. And it has its own, as far as I understand, version control system to actually track all the versions of the documentation and content. That's all I know about it. Maybe someone else can provide us additional comments on these standards. This is basically what I could find in terms of tooling. So basically, we have a lot of generic XML editors that can help us to work with the XMLs, and some of them has these plugins to actually understand these documentation specific extensions like DITA, DocBook, S1000D. And again, some of them actually supports what you see is what you get approach. So you don't have to look at these XML text every time you need to change something. That's very good. Yes. But yet again, some of them, like FrameMaker and so on, are actually proprietary software that you have to pay to get access to and to get trained for. That's actually a negative side of that. But there are some open source, including, I believe, Oxygen XML editor is an open source one. So I guess you can go without paying for it, but originally it really depends on what you're using, because these standards can be compatible with each other, but the building system and like the stage of producing your doc, the stage of building your docs can be incompatible between. So the content you can migrate by the design template. I mean, it can be quite tricky, so pay attention to it. It can be a little bit of a vendor lock. This is a comparison of between three, just repeating ourselves. So the DITA is focused on topics, DocBook is a hierarchical documentation top to bottom, and S1000D is best for regulated, safe, critical environments when you have these compliance issues. Honorable mentions are, we have a very good piece of software called Madcap Flare, but unfortunately, it is using XML format, but unfortunately, it's its own proprietary XML format. So it's more or less incompatible with others. It has some import and export features, of course, but I would still be a little bit concerned with using it because it's very expensive. It has a very expensive license, and you can be vendor locked, as far as I understand, because it's a proprietary format in the beginning. Yes, some export features let you export format. I'm not sure how good they are. And the second honorable mention, I actually quite like this one. This one is my favorite. This is PanDoc document converter. It supports so many different formats that I'm actually amazed. The results, they vary from content to content. I have actually a very pleasant experience with converting a big set of documentation, like literally hundreds of pages in docx format. I've converted them successfully to AsciiDoc at some point, and the result was it wasn't good at the beginning, but it has so many different features. The PanDoc, I mean, so many settings. So after maybe a day of playing with the parameters, I was able to achieve some decent results. So yeah, just a human review after that was enough, I would say. It's not great. It's not AI based or anything. It's not that fancy, but it does the job and it does it good. It's a very reliable instrument. I totally recommend. So when we're talking about all these markups, how do we select one that we need? And you might be surprised, but we have two basic categories to choose from: lightweight markup languages and XML-based formats that we just discussed. Overall comparison between them is quite easy, right? We have the simpler markup languages on the lightweight category. That's like in the name. They use a lot of open source tools. That's quite handy, actually. They use Git, and most of them like very reliant on the Git capabilities. You can use IDEs and any other text editor for basically working with this content. And the only like considerable negative side here that I see, that they do require this extra effort of assembly and fine-tuning. So you really have to understand what you're doing and get into these tools that you have selected to be able to produce the best possible results. On the XML-based format side, we actually have this out-of-the-box solution quite often. So basically, you buy a license for some tool that produces you all the output formats you might need. If it doesn't produce some of the formats that you need, I'm not sure you can do a lot about it. You can try with some of the solutions. If they have export features, you may try to export to some intermediary format and then produce something out of this. Sometimes it's possible, sometimes it's not, but I feel like it really depends on your exact solution that you are using. But most often you will be provided with what you see, what you get editor, especially with these paid proprietary solutions. It's very good for structured writing, at least the DITA and S1000D. And yeah, in some cases, like the fields with a lot of compliance issues, like aerospace engineering, you might be even required to use S1000D or anything like that, very specific. So overall comparison is just like that. How to actually select one of the approaches, the very first stage, I would quite often just advise people consider Markdown as the very first stage. Just because of its popularity and simplicity, it actually avoids a lot of problems on the later stages of adopting this solution, and it makes it so much easier, and the tooling is like so rich and great. You can find some tool that does exactly what you need, and even if you're not very you're not feeling that good with that particular tool that you selected, you can probably migrate to another one. And the second question that immediately comes after you selected Markdown is what you're lacking, because Markdown is not that good with additional features. You might try it on some set of documents, maybe some test pieces of your documents, maybe it's just a single document, and see what you're missing here. Maybe some additional formatting for the text, maybe some additional formatting for tables, maybe some links, maybe some single sourcing of the content on multiple different documents. There are so many features that it can lack, so you have to decide on what you actually need on top of what Markdown has to offer. Sometimes you don't need much. For example, for a personal blog or some smaller set of documentation with not a lot of interesting formatting going on, it can be already out of the box good enough. I assure you, I've been using it quite successfully for some pieces. In terms of when you are actually decided that list of things you're lacking in there, you can consider using extensions, because Markdown lets you use just pure and simple HTML code inside your Markdown, and that can solve a lot of problems with tables. Actually, it looks ugly, understandably, yes, and it's really hard to change anything in this content later on because you need to read raw HTML code. Well, some people do prefer read the raw HTML code, but not most of us. And there are some extensions that can extend the syntax of Markdown, although I do believe that they also look quite ugly quite often. And as I said before, they can be quite custom. So it can be tricky to migrate this content later on to another solution because it can have a different kind of automation going on, a different kind of extension, different kind of syntax, basically, for such a feature. If you kind of exhausted your questions here and you're still not satisfied with Markdown, with the extensions, you can consider later stages other alternatives, which are reStructuredText and AsciiDoc. And namely, you have to decide to select between them whether you want to use Python to actually automate your docs features. If you're very good with Python and you do prefer it, then I would advise you to go reStructuredText, because you can do so much with the knowledge of Python there. You barely need anything else, actually. It's so powerful with Python, so it suits all your needs, I assure you. But if you are not very keen to use Python, like to automate this, and you want more for like out-of-the-box results, or at least less programming to do that, you can consider using AsciiDoc, and I especially recommend Antora, because it's actually out of the box, provides you with quite a lot, and it's quite opinionated on how you can do stuff, and it might be just what you need to get started. Still, it's both of which, like reStructuredText and AsciiDoc, I would still consider like more sophisticated solutions in terms of if you need something more challenging than Markdown, more featureful, or you just have like extensive pieces of documentation and you expect it to use all these additional features. You see, if you have a smaller piece, I would still strongly advise you use Markdown. At least that's my advice. And that's it. Let's move on. What we have in Canonical as a cherry on top. So basically, we have the following factors that we need to account for. Basically, we have a very big portfolio of software products, very diverse community of users, and on top of that, active open source contributors. And we need to accommodate all these factors. That's why we mostly use Markdown as the most popular one. You guessed right. Basically, for some products, we use Discourse as our main platform to store and edit documentation right on the Discourse platform. And it's quite good, and it uses Markdown, so everyone can get there and quite easily start their contributions to our documentation. But in some other products, we use Sphinx plus Read the Docs. Read the Docs is a service that actually automates building and publishing documentation. And Sphinx is a solution, the main one, for the reStructuredText. But we use it with some kind of a plugin, Mist, I believe it's called, that actually lets you use Markdown again. So yes, this plugin extensibility actually lets you use these lightweight markup languages quite interchangeably in some solutions that actually have these plugins. And in terms of Sphinx, it has one for Markdown. That's what we're using. We can use both reStructuredText and Markdown in our documentation in these cases. I wouldn't even dare to compare them, which one is better for now, but here's what we use. And at this point, that's all I have for you. Let's wait for these questions and opinions on which language is the best.
Wow, thank you so much, Vladimir. That was really wonderful. You've obviously gone to a lot of work and effort in that in the 40 slides. So yeah, thank you. Yeah, and Robert, you've got your hand up.
First of all, thanks. That was a really nice overview, and lots of research went into that. So thanks. I was just wondering. I've been using all of these for some time, and leaving aside the XML-based, which I suppose if you get over the pain of XML, they're probably the most flexible ones. But you said that RST and AsciiDoc are pretty much par on features, and that hasn't been my experience. And I'm wondering, it seems to me that AsciiDoc is much more featureful, that it allows you to do a whole lot more things than reStructuredText, and the flexibility of the features that are included in RST is better in AsciiDoc. So I was wondering, just what made you put them side by side in the feature richness category, because that just didn't sit well with me.
I understand, yes. As far as my experience goes, Sphinx always used with some kind of these additional extensions already out of the box, and you can quite easily find those on the internet and just reuse content. And as far as you're kind of familiar with Python, they are not that hard to use, and it feels like this is the experience of Sphinx, how it's intended to be used. So basically going there and copy and pasting some Python code just to be able to use some additional feature seems like how Sphinx is designed to be. And the AsciiDoc experience is quite different. I totally understand that. I would still have a quite hard time to believe that we can compare them in features, because AsciiDoc is a bit more limited to what it can do, but out of the box, it has probably a bit more in terms of features without these code copy pastings. But Sphinx is intended to use them, and I don't know. I do understand what you mean by Sphinx not having all the fancy features out of the box, but it feels like it still has so much potential that they almost feels on the same level to me. You just have to know Python for the Sphinx one.
True. You can probably program anything in Python and extend Sphinx as well as RST that way. Anyway, I don't want to prolong it too long, but I'd be, aside offline, or I'd be really interested in, if you have a feature or a set of features that RST supports that AsciiDoc doesn't, then, just really out of curiosity, I'd be interested, because I was racking my brain during your presentation, and I really couldn't come up with anything. So I'm just really curious.
I don't know any features that RST supports out of the box that AsciiDoc doesn't have. But I do have seen a lot of additional features created by DocOps specialists that were quite easy to implement and was quite powerful in terms of what we could do just with a little bit of Python in the Sphinx.
Thank you.
Anyone, please feel free to raise your hand or even type a question in the comments, and we'll read them out. I've got a question, Vladimir. So I suppose I have a preference for Markdown because it's the easiest to kind of compose documentation from. I don't have to think about it. I don't have to remember the syntax particularly. If I'm actually writing something, it's probably just a text file with things that are kind of Markdown compliant. And I wondered, do you work in AsciiDoc in the same way, or do you write something first and then convert it to AsciiDoc later?
No, you can work in AsciiDoc pretty naturally, just out of the box in its natural syntax. The problem is when you work with multiple of the markup languages. Basically, I had a lot of problem with confusing one to another when I had to switch between Markdown and AsciiDoc. So it's still doable. They're still pretty easy, and you can probably figure it out quite easily. I would say that AsciiDoc looks a bit more elegant to me, but down the line, yes, they are both quite simple and easy to use. You can use them quite naturally.
And Iqbal says, in projects I work with, Markdown is often the only option because most developers don't want to learn how to work with anything else. Essentially, this means that using anything but Markdown results in sacrificing community support and documentation. Actually, that's very true. I was going to bring this up, but I'm always surprised that developers don't want, especially Python developers don't want to work with restructured text or Sphinx. But in my experience, they're resistant. But I'm going to hand it over to Dan, who's got his hand up. Over to you, Dan. You're muted. Sorry.
Yeah, I am muted. You mentioned that Markdown doesn't support includes, and I realize it doesn't, but I could not live without includes. So I use MDX, which basically all I use out of it. I do write a few components in JavaScript to supplement the docs, but 99% of the reason why I use MDX is so that I can have includes, because I could not live without them. So just wanted to throw that in.
I totally understand you. It's very, very important actually to, the single source principle, yes, to actually know and follow it and understand why it's important. I cannot live without it, for sure. But yeah, unfortunately, out of the box, just a common Markdown does not support it, although it's not that hard to extend it to abilities. Yeah.
Yeah, the problem I have is, when I do use the includes, people reading the docs directly in GitHub don't see the included content. It messes it up for that experience, but I live with it.
Good. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. And Nick, yeah. Sorry, Vladimir.
No problem.
I was just going to say that for every feature that isn't available as standard in Markdown, there is, as Dan's already pointed out, there's some build tool somewhere that does implement it. There are all sorts of extensions, and also in my picking up on the contributor aspect of this, I've worked in big doc sets in DocBook XML, in Sphinx, in Markdown, less so in AsciiDoc. I have contributed to some using that. In my experience, nobody wants to contribute to anything apart from Markdown. That it's just a no-brainer if you're expecting people to contribute to even internally. That seems to be the case.
I quite understand what you mean, but there is a catch in that. Basically, what I experienced once, some kind of experiment, you can call it. Imagine we have a README file on GitHub, and it's written in AsciiDoc. And as far as I remember, GitHub already quite long ago started supporting rendering AsciiDoc syntax. And this particular README file, if some kind of engineer wants to contribute to it, it just goes there, they just go there and contribute without thinking about the syntax. They just follow the flow, the file itself provides them with the reference, and they just contribute to AsciiDoc without asking, oh, it's actually not Markdown. So that actually occurred to me not even once. So it actually happened, and I'm not sure how we can use it, how we can scale it up. But that's the problem here. It's not the problem of them not knowing something, that them kind of limiting themselves and not wanting to spend extra effort. So if you provide them with enough context of the syntax in the file itself, I think they can do it. It's not that hard. They just don't need to overthink it.
I've actually just created a quick poll just to see if what people may prefer, what people are using. Vladimir, it seems like XML-based formats or documentation. A lot of what you showed was graphical editors, and things like the open documentation format or the open document format is also very similar in its OASIS schema. Does that mean is like XML like the TIFF of documentation formats in that you can derive everything else from it? And is that right? Should we like have an all-encompassing format that we can then convert downwards from? I worry a little bit that if we start with Markdown and then use Pandoc, we're kind of just losing information every time we do the conversion.
You see, XML is a pretty good format in its origin to store and transmit data, and it can store and transmit almost anything. Like literally, it's so flexible. It can do so many different things, and it can do it quite good. Although it's quite heavy to use directly by a human being, like write manually. So, just as an example of what it can do, the AsciiDoc solution for the AsciiDoc uses DocBook format, which is XML format, for the output. So basically, when you use even Antora uses AsciiDoc.js, and it produces DocBook as an intermediary format before producing your end result. So basically, that actually shows you something. That first of all, AsciiDoc, which is my favorite to be honest, already being established as a feature equivalent with the DocBook. So basically everything could be done with an AsciiDoc, natural AsciiDoc could be done with DocBook, and it gets converted into DocBook. That says something, right? These XML formats are quite good for that, for the machine processing of some data, especially with metadata involved, yes. The human readable aspect is quite awful here, and that's why I do prefer AsciiDoc over DocBook, obviously. So yes, we can convert any documentation, well, maybe not any, but 99% I'm sure we can convert into XML-based source code, but why?
Yeah.
As far as we use Docs code, we do enjoy the simplicity of the syntax and the ability to actually see in the pull request itself on the GitHub what's changed and read it directly. That's what I enjoy very much.
Yeah. Thanks. So there's a question here from Peter. You listed platforms that are compatible with Markdown and AsciiDoc earlier, and AsciiDoc had limited platforms. What do you think makes AsciiDoc limited capability-wise, despite being just as simple and easily learnable as Markdown?
It's not limited capability-wise. It has more capabilities. It's limited in its popularity, and popularity is a strange thing. Basically, we kind of have a popular product already, Markdown, and no one sees a serious reason to learn something else. It has to be some very deliberate and prolonged effort to migrate people from Markdown to something else. And I'm not sure it's even possible at this stage. It's just historically arranged this way. That's all an understanding I have for now.
Yeah, go for it, Artem.
Thank you. Thank you, Vladimir. I had a remark, actually. Markdown's expressive capabilities are very limited for a very good reason. And this reason is the same fact that makes it very popular. The reason for its popularity, because it severely limits you to a set of maybe tools, a set of limited usages, and doesn't demand anything else from you. And basically it walls you into a very, very small pen where you can feel safe and secure. So this is not a drawback, not a disadvantage. It's a design decision. And very good at that. What I'm getting at is actually if you feel that using Markdown limits your documentation effort, then you are maybe using it, I wouldn't say wrong, but maybe it's not the right tool for the job that you're trying to do, because it's intended for very, very lightweight procedures and workflows and documentation sets, and there it does its job really well.
I understand what you mean, and absolutely agree with you, but let me a bit add to it that originally Markdown wasn't created just for the documentation. Yes, it was created as a universal text processing markup that you can use in anything. And as a great example, most instant messengers nowadays can use some form of Markdown, at least some features of it. So basically, the idea is it's like an embedded language that can use in your text-based solution for anything. If you need instant messenger with some additional capabilities, here we are, Markdown. If you have a forum like a good old PHP BB or something like this, Discourse, which also uses Markdown, here we go. You have a language. And yes, of course, when we try to push the boundaries and use it to very extreme with some cool features for our cool technical documentation, of course, we kind of misusing the tool, not for its original purpose, but still the idea that we started using it because it's so popular and we want to engage with our community, it's limiting. Yes, sometimes it's limiting us as engineers because we kind of can put this effort into overcoming Markdown's limitations, while we expect our community not overcome any obstacles of any other markup language. You know, we just try to provide them with the best possible experience. So we lower the bar specifically for our community and specifically expecting that we will suffer the consequences. I totally understand what you mean, I think.
Yes, it's a good equalizer.
Maybe showing that there's quite a few people from Canonical here, but the poll is currently being led by Markdown with 5 votes and AsciiDoc by 2.
Oh, nice.
We've just got a couple of minutes left. If anybody wants to ask a quick question, please go ahead. I do have a question. I hope this isn't putting you on the spot. I hope it's not doesn't require too much thought. But I was going to ask you if you could take one feature of each of those syntaxes or markups from Markdown, from restructured text, from AsciiDoc, and from XML-based formats, what would it be?
Oh, I don't know. My favorite AsciiDoc, obviously, and I do like
what feature would you take, like the legibility or the ease of the flat format for Markdown?
I really have a hard time to choose between tables and code blocks in AsciiDoc. In restructured text, there are a few that I do like, but probably the idea of fencing the headings before and after with the long lines, it's really easy to see in the source code this way. And well, Markdown is just its simplicity overall, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or maybe support and popularity. Maybe this one. Yeah. If you consider that a feature.
I did used to work on a very complicated project with a lot of XML and using DITA and XSLT, and it was there to solve a complicated problem of interdependencies and single source. And I thought, you know, that's there, it exists as a solution. But nowadays, I think probably the architecture of the documentation was wrong to require such a complicated solution.
Yeah, I keep hearing that the DITA and DITA-based solutions actually let you deal with large sets of documentation, but I do also keep hearing that it requires a lot of maintenance. So
yeah. It's like a programmatic solution, really, if there is one for documentation.
I see.
So yeah, thank you so much again. Thank you to everybody who's joined. Next week, let me just open up the schedule. We've got Artem, who just asked a question, who's going to talk about documenting a new project. So you've just had a brilliant idea, you've put some code together, and you've created the repo, and you're just going to start on the docs. So Artem's going to talk about all of that. Thank you. I'm going to stop the recording and hopefully see you next week.